I didn't recognize the moment my life began to tilt, only that something familiar suddenly felt uncertain. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, under fluorescent lights, with coffee cooling on my desk and deadlines humming in the background. That's when Emily Carter looked up from her laptop and smiled at me, not politely, not briefly, but with a warmth that felt intentional. It caught me off guard in a way I wasn't prepared to explain. I was Daniel Brooks, 34, married, dependable. The kind of man people trusted with responsibilities and secrets but never suspected of wanting more. My marriage to Rachel wasn't failing, it was simply settled. We had routines instead of conversations, coordination instead of curiosity. I told myself that was what stability looked like. Emily had joined our department 3 months earlier. She wasn't flashy or loud, no dramatic entrances, no forced charm. What she had was attentiveness. She listened closely, asked questions that lingered, and remembered answers long after most people forgot them. When she spoke to me, it felt as if the rest of the room softened. At first, our interactions were professional. Shared projects. Brief check-ins. Necessary emails. But there was an undercurrent I couldn't quite name. She noticed when I skipped lunch. Commented when I seemed distracted. Once, she asked if I was happy, then quickly laughed it off, as if the question had slipped out by accident. That question followed me home. Rachel was folding laundry when I walked in that night, the television murmuring in the background. She smiled, asked how my day was, and listened just long enough to respond. We moved around each other with practiced ease, two people who knew how to coexist without colliding. I loved her, I was sure of that, but love had become something quiet and managed. The next day, Emily stopped by my desk with a file I hadn't asked for. I thought this might help, she said. It did, but not for the reason she meant. Our fingers brushed as I took it from her. A small thing. Accidental. Yet the moment stayed with me longer than it should have. I noticed how she lingered before walking away, how she glanced back as if expecting me to say something more. I didn't. But as I watched her return to her desk, I felt the first stirrings of conflict between who I was and who I might become if I kept paying attention. Nothing had happened. No rules were broken. And still, I knew something had begun. That realization settled uneasily in my chest, leaving me with a question I couldn't ignore. What do you do when attraction arrives quietly and asks nothing of you, yet threatens everything you already have? In the weeks that followed, I became acutely aware of how easily a life can split into visible and invisible parts. On the surface, everything remained unchanged. I arrived at work on time, answered emails, attended meetings, and returned home to Rachel each evening. Yet beneath that routine, something restless had taken root, growing quietly but persistently. Emily's presence sharpened my awareness of myself. She had a way of drawing people out without pressing them, asking questions that felt optional but meaningful. During one late afternoon meeting, she asked for my opinion, then waited, really waited, as if my response mattered more than efficiency. I noticed how she nodded as I spoke, how her expression shifted with genuine interest. It made me feel seen in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Rachel, meanwhile, moved through our days with calm reliability. She scheduled dinners, managed our finances, and reminded me of family obligations. We functioned well together, but our conversations skimmed the surface, rarely dipping into uncertainty or desire. I told myself this was normal, that comfort was the natural evolution of love. Still, when Emily laughed at one of my dry jokes later that same day, the contrast was impossible to ignore. The central conflict emerged not through action, but through awareness. I began noticing patterns: Emily choosing the seat across from me during meetings, her messages arriving just when my focus drifted, her subtle habit of lowering her voice when speaking to me. None of it crossed a line, yet all of it edged closer than it should have. One evening, as we worked late to finish a project, Emily glanced at the darkened windows and sighed. "Do you ever feel like time moves differently when you're not paying attention?" she asked. I hesitated before answering, unsettled by how closely the question mirrored my own thoughts. "Sometimes," I said. "Especially when I realize I've been on autopilot." She smiled, not triumphantly, but with quiet understanding. That look carried more weight than any confession could have. It suggested recognition of me, of herself, of the unspoken space forming between us. At home that night, I lay awake beside Rachel, listening to her steady breathing. I felt a growing divide between the man I appeared to be and the man responding to Emily's attention. Guilt followed close behind, but it failed to extinguish the curiosity driving me forward. By the end of that week, I understood that the conflict was no longer external. No confrontation had occurred, no decision forced. Yet the question lingered, persistent and unresolved, whether awareness alone could become a kind of betrayal. As I fell asleep, one thought returned with unsettling clarity: whatever was unfolding, it was no longer accidental. By the time I admitted something was changing, it had already altered the rhythm of my days. I noticed it in the small adjustments I made without thinking: arriving a few minutes earlier to work, lingering longer in shared spaces, anticipating Emily's presence before I actually saw her. These weren't choices I planned, they were instincts, and that realization unsettled me. Emily never pushed. That was part of what made everything harder to define. She didn't flirt openly or demand attention. Instead, she offered consistency, listening, remembering, responding with care. When she asked how my weekend had been, she didn't glance at her phone mid-answer. When I spoke, she absorbed my words as if they mattered beyond the moment. One afternoon, during a break between meetings, she said quietly, "You always look like you're carrying more than you let on." I laughed it off, but the comment landed with uncomfortable accuracy. "Maybe I just overthink," I replied. "Or maybe you think just enough," she said, meeting my eyes. That exchange stayed with me longer than it should have. It wasn't what she said, exactly, it was the ease with which she said it, as if she'd already mapped parts of me I hadn't shared. I began to recognize the central tension not as temptation, but as recognition. Emily seemed to notice the version of myself that had gone unacknowledged for years. At home, Rachel and I moved through our evenings efficiently. Dinner, dishes, light conversation, sleep. There was affection, but it felt preserved rather than renewed. I found myself withholding pieces of my day not because they were inappropriate, but because explaining them felt dangerous. The omission itself became a quiet burden. The conflict sharpened when Emily and I were assigned to collaborate more closely. Long stretches of focused work gave way to conversations that drifted toward personal territory, carefully, cautiously. She spoke about her past with measured honesty, never asking for sympathy, only understanding. I responded in kind, surprised by how easily words came to me. One evening, as we wrapped up, she paused and said, "I hope this isn't strange, but I feel like our conversations matter." I just wanted to say that. I nodded, my chest tightening. "They do," I replied, before I could reconsider. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was weighted. Nothing had crossed a boundary, yet something undeniable had formed. We both sensed it, and for the first time, neither of us pretended otherwise. As I drove home that night, I understood that the story was no longer about attraction alone. It was about choice, about whether awareness would lead to restraint or momentum. The road ahead felt uncertain, but one truth was clear: pretending nothing was happening was no longer an option. The tension didn't arrive all at once, it accumulated through moments I couldn't undo. By now, Emily and I understood the careful balance we were maintaining, close enough to feel connected, distant enough to claim innocence. That awareness shaped every interaction, sharpening both restraint and desire. Our conversations grew more deliberate. We spoke less often, but with greater intensity, choosing words that carried weight without exposing intent. When Emily asked how things were at home, her tone remained neutral, yet her eyes searched my face for honesty. I answered cautiously, offering partial truths that kept the larger reality safely concealed. Rachel sensed the shift before I admitted it to myself. She didn't accuse or interrogate, instead, she observed. One evening, she asked, "You've been quieter lately. Is something on your mind?" Her concern was genuine, and that made my hesitation feel cruel. "I'm just tired," I said, leaning on a familiar excuse. At work, Emily and I were assigned a presentation that required late preparation. The office emptied around us, leaving behind the hum of lights and the muted city beyond the windows. The quiet felt intimate, charged with everything we refused to name. "You don't have to stay this late," she said, glancing at the time. "I don't mind," I replied, aware that the truth was more complicated. As we reviewed notes, our conversation drifted from logistics to meaning, why work mattered, what fulfillment looked like, how easily people accepted less than they wanted. Emily spoke carefully, as if choosing each word for both clarity and caution. "Sometimes," she said, "not choosing is still a choice." The statement lingered between us. I felt its weight settle into the spaces I'd been avoiding. For weeks, I had convinced myself that inaction protected everyone involved. Yet the connection we shared had already altered my attention, my thoughts, my sense of self. Later that night, as we packed up, Emily hesitated. "I need to know something," she said softly. "If this is becoming too much, tell me. I don't want to be the reason someone gets hurt." Her directness left no room for evasion. I met her gaze, seeing not expectation, but restraint. "It's not too much," I said carefully. "But it is complicated." She nodded, accepting the answer without relief or disappointment. That restraint, hers and mine, felt heavier than a confession would have. At home, Rachel was already asleep when I arrived. I stood in the doorway, watching her breathe, aware of how fragile certainty can be. I understood then that the conflict was no longer abstract. It lived in my silence, my divided attention, my growing awareness of what I was risking by continuing as I was. As I turned off the light, one realization pressed forward with uncomfortable clarity. Whatever I chose next would define not just this moment, but the man I would become afterward. The following days carried a heightened clarity, as if the world had sharpened its edges. I no longer mistook habit for safety or silence for neutrality. Every interaction, with Emily, with Rachel, felt deliberate, charged with consequence. The conflict I'd tried to keep contained had begun to demand resolution. Emily sensed the shift before I spoke. We met briefly in the break room one morning, our exchange restrained but weighted. "You've been thinking," she said, not as a question. "So have you," I replied. She smiled faintly, acknowledging the truth without pressing it. That restraint, once comforting, now felt like a test. I realized how much effort it took to remain poised between possibility and responsibility, and how unsustainable that balance had become. At home, Rachel's patience grew more visible. She asked questions she hadn't asked in years about my work, my mood, my silences. I answered honestly where I could and carefully where I couldn't. The distance between us wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, formed by omissions and unspoken realizations. I could sense her awareness growing, even without proof. The central conflict finally crystallized one evening after work, when Emily and I crossed paths in the parking garage. The space was quiet, echoing, stripped of the distractions that usually softened our conversations. "I think we're approaching a moment," she said calmly. "And pretending otherwise won't make it pass." I nodded, relieved by her clarity. "I know. I don't want to be someone you escape into," she continued. "And I don't want to disappear either." Her words framed the choice I'd been avoiding. This wasn't about temptation alone, it was about integrity. About whether I would continue allowing emotional proximity to replace honest reckoning. "I need to figure out what I'm doing," I said. "Not just with us. With my life." She accepted that answer without argument. That's all I needed to hear. That night, I sat with Rachel at the kitchen table long after dinner was cleared. The air between us felt fragile but real. I didn't confess everything yet, but I admitted enough to signal that something needed attention. The conversation was difficult, incomplete, and necessary. As I went to bed, I understood that the story hadn't reached its climax. The choices ahead remained unresolved, their outcomes uncertain. But the direction was finally clear. Whatever came next would require action, not avoidance, and that realization, more than anything, ensured the story was far from over. The days that followed carried a new weight, one I couldn't ignore. Every glance, every word, every pause between Emily and me felt charged with unspoken meaning. I found myself measuring my own reactions, what I said, what I withheld, even where I looked, aware that the invisible line separating attention from desire was thinner than I had ever imagined. Emily remained careful. Nothing she did crossed boundaries, yet everything hinted at connection. One morning, she lingered by the copier, her posture relaxed but eyes alert. "You okay?" she asked, noticing the faint tension in my shoulders. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a casual tone I didn't feel. Her gaze softened. "Just seems like you're carrying more than usual." It wasn't accusation. It was observation. And that distinction made it nearly impossible to deny the stirrings I had long tried to suppress. At home, Rachel's attentiveness grew subtly insistent. She asked questions about my day, my mood, even the projects I'd been handling. Each inquiry carried a quiet concern that contrasted with my growing internal distraction. The juxtaposition made me painfully aware of what was at stake, what could be lost if I didn't confront the tension building inside me. The turning point came unexpectedly during a late meeting at work. Emily and I were alone in the conference room, reviewing documents under the dim glow of fluorescent lights. The office was silent except for the low hum of the city beyond the windows. "I feel like we're in this strange pause," Emily said quietly. "Like something's happening, but no one is naming it." I swallowed hard. She had said aloud what I had been circling for weeks, the reality I'd tried to rationalize away. "I don't know how to name it either," I admitted. Her expression was calm, measured, yet charged. "It's not just about what we feel," she said. "It's about what we choose to do with it." The words hung in the air between us, precise and unavoidable. I realized that the conflict wasn't external. It wasn't even about attraction. It was about choice, about integrity, loyalty, and the life I had promised to uphold. Every hesitation, every glance, every subtle signal now demanded conscious acknowledgement. That night, I drove home in silence, the city lights blurring past the windshield. I could see Rachel in my mind's eye, her quiet warmth, her trust, the life we had built together. I could also see Emily, her attentiveness, her insight, her uncanny ability to notice the pieces of me I had hidden, even from myself. By the time I reached my driveway, I understood the truth. Nothing could remain neutral anymore. Whatever path I chose would redefine everything, my marriage, my relationships, and even my own understanding of who I was. And for the first time, I felt the weight of that responsibility in full, undeniable clarity. The story had reached a juncture where reflection alone would no longer suffice. Action was inevitable, and the choices I made next would echo far longer than the fleeting moments that had brought me here. By now, the tension had become a persistent companion. Every encounter with Emily carried an unspoken weight, and every moment at home reminded me of the line I could not and must not cross. It was a precarious balance, one maintained by restraint, subtlety, and careful observation. Yet the more I tried to manage it, the more the conflict gnawed at me from within. One Thursday afternoon, Emily and I were tasked with preparing a client presentation together. The office was quiet, most co-workers having left for the day. The room felt smaller somehow, charged by the proximity we could no longer ignore. She leaned over the laptop, reviewing slides, her hand brushing mine briefly. The touch was accidental, or so we both pretended, but it sent a jolt through me that I could neither deny nor explain. "You've been distant lately," she said softly, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, aware of the delicate truth hidden behind my own hesitation. "I'm fine," I replied, knowing it was half the truth. Half the lie. Her gaze lingered, perceptive and patient. "You know, sometimes it's easier to admit things than to carry them." Her words echoed in my mind long after she left the room. They weren't a temptation. They weren't even a confession. They were simply recognition of everything I had been avoiding and trying to rationalize away. I realized that the most difficult part of the conflict wasn't Emily, it was me. It was what I felt, what I feared, and the choices I had yet to confront. At home that evening, Rachel's quiet presence felt both comforting and suffocating. She noticed the subtle shift in my demeanor, the tension I couldn't fully conceal. "You've been somewhere else all day," she observed. "Talk to me." I wanted to. I wanted to confess, to untangle the emotions clawing at me. But I couldn't. Not yet. The truth wasn't simply about attraction, it was about accountability, about loyalty, about understanding what I stood to lose if I let curiosity outweigh commitment. That night, I lay awake, replaying the day in fragments: Emily's perceptive gaze, the accidental touch, her words that felt heavier than anything I had heard in years. I thought about Rachel, her unwavering presence, her trust, and the life we had painstakingly built together. The juxtaposition was unbearable, and it forced me to confront an uncomfortable question. Could one moment of honesty salvage everything, or would it shatter the fragile balance I had been clinging to? By morning, a decision had begun to form, not in clarity, not yet, but as a pressing urgency. Avoidance was no longer an option. Every glance, every conversation, every subtle signal had built toward this inevitable confrontation. The path ahead was uncertain, lined with consequences I could not yet measure, but I knew that ignoring it would only deepen the fracture within me. The realization settled like a stone in my chest. The conflict I had tried to manage quietly had grown beyond whispers and glances. It demanded recognition, action, and courage, whether I was ready or not. And in that understanding, I felt the first true awareness of the choices that would define not only the next days, but the man I would ultimately become. The tension that had been quietly building reached a point where subtlety was no longer sufficient. Every word, every glance, every shared space between Emily and me now carried the weight of unspoken possibilities. It wasn't desire alone that complicated things, it was the awareness of what that desire could cost, the fragile lives and commitments balanced on a knife's edge. One evening, the office was nearly empty. We were finishing a project under the soft hum of fluorescent lights, the city skyline faintly glowing outside the windows. Emily looked at me, her expression careful but unmistakably attentive. "Daniel," she began, her voice quiet but deliberate, "we can keep pretending this isn't happening. Or we can acknowledge it. But ignoring it doesn't make it go away." I swallowed hard. Her honesty was piercing, not a confession, but an insistence on recognition. I realized in that moment that the conflict wasn't something to evade. It had taken residence in the spaces between our words, the pauses in our conversations, and the moments when neither of us looked away. "I know," I admitted. "And I don't want to make a mistake. Not with you. Not with anyone." She nodded, eyes steady. "Then be careful. And be honest with yourself." Leaving the office, I felt the weight of those words pressing on me. The drive home was silent, the streets empty, yet every turn of the wheel seemed louder in my mind. I thought about Rachel, folding laundry in the kitchen, humming softly. About our shared life, its patterns and predictability. About the warmth I had taken for granted. And then I thought about Emily, about the way she saw the parts of me I had long ignored, the attention that felt almost intrusive because it demanded acknowledgement. By the time I reached home, the choice was no longer abstract. I could continue to compartmentalize, pretend that awareness and restraint were sufficient shields. Or I could confront the truth, openly and painfully, with Rachel and myself. The emotional cost was daunting, yet the alternative, continued avoidance, felt like a slow erosion of integrity. Inside, Rachel looked up as I entered. Her eyes, always observant, seemed to notice more than I was willing to admit. I hesitated, the silence stretching between us. "I need to talk," I said, finally, the words weighted but necessary. She nodded, waiting. And in that moment, I realized the central conflict of my life had reached a tipping point. It wasn't just about attraction. It wasn't even about Emily or Rachel alone. It was about truth, choice, and the courage required to face the consequences of both. I didn't have the answers yet, but I understood this. The story could no longer remain hidden in fleeting glances and subtle signals. The next steps would define everything: who I was, who I wanted to be, and whether the life I valued most could survive honesty. For the first time in weeks, I felt the undeniable clarity that comes when avoidance is no longer an option. The real challenge was about to begin. The conversation with Rachel was nothing like I had imagined it would be. I had rehearsed every word in my mind, anticipating anger, disappointment, or tears. Instead, the room held a quiet tension, a fragile stillness that demanded honesty without spectacle. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands folded, eyes alert but patient, waiting for me to speak. "I need to tell you something," I began, my voice low, steadying myself against the tremor I felt inside. It's not about action, not yet, but I can't keep pretending nothing has changed. Her brow furrowed slightly, curiosity mingled with caution. What do you mean? I paused, realizing that every hesitation stretched the space between us further. There's someone at work, someone who's noticed me in a way I haven't been noticed in a long time. And I've allowed myself to feel things I shouldn't, even if nothing has happened. Rachel exhaled slowly. The silence that followed was neither accusatory nor forgiving. It was measured, as though she were weighing not just my words, but their implications. I see, she said finally, her voice calm. And you're telling me this because I respect you, I admitted, feeling the weight of the confession press into my chest. Because I can't move forward honestly without acknowledging it. For a long moment, she said nothing, letting my words settle between us. Then, softly, she asked, "Do you want this to change things?" "I don't know," I confessed. "I just know that continuing like this would be unfair to you, to me, to everyone involved." Her gaze softened, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the gravity of understanding settle in. She wasn't seeking drama. She wasn't demanding proof. She was seeking truth and perhaps, clarity. The admission brought with it an unexpected relief, a recognition that avoidance had only prolonged the tension I could no longer manage. It didn't erase the complexity, the attraction, or the emotional pull I felt toward Emily, but it shifted the focus. The conflict was no longer lurking in shadows or subtle glances, it was acknowledged, named, and now required conscious navigation. That night, I lay awake beside Rachel, reflecting on the precarious balance I had been maintaining. Emily's presence had been magnetic, illuminating aspects of myself I had ignored. Rachel's patience, on the other hand, revealed the depth of what I risked losing. Both were real. Both mattered. I understood then that the next steps would not be about denying feelings, nor about succumbing to them. They would be about discernment, integrity, and the courage to face consequences honestly. As sleep approached, I felt the first flicker of clarity in weeks. The conflict was no longer abstract or hidden. It existed in plain sight, demanding recognition, honesty, and careful choice. And in that awareness, I realized the story was far from over, but at least, for the first time, I knew where I stood. The days that followed carried a tension that was equal parts fragile and unavoidable. Emily had requested a transfer to another department, citing her own need for space. The decision, though professional on the surface, felt personal to me, a quiet severing of the connection that had grown too complex to ignore. Walking past her desk for the last time, I realized that what I felt for her had never been about desire alone. It was about recognition, understanding, and a mirror reflecting parts of myself I had long neglected. At home, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Rachel noticed the change in my demeanor, the absence of that quiet pull pulling my attention elsewhere. She didn't demand explanations. Instead, she observed, careful and patient, sensing the restoration of attention I had withheld for weeks. Her presence, once taken for granted, now felt vibrant again, demanding engagement, honesty, and presence. I understood that the conflict had never truly been between two people. It had been within me from the moment I allowed myself to recognize subtle attraction, to the realization that feelings, no matter how innocent, have consequences. The most challenging moments had not been the glances or the conversations with Emily, but the acknowledgement of my own emotional vulnerability and the choices it demanded. One evening, Rachel and I sat together on the porch, the night quiet except for the faint rustle of leaves. I reached for her hand, hesitating only briefly before taking the step that had felt impossible for so long. "I haven't been completely present," I admitted softly. "And I want to change that." She squeezed my hand gently. "I've noticed," she said. "It matters that you see it now." Her words, simple and measured, carried more weight than any dramatic confession could. It was not absolution I sought, it was awareness, and with her, I found a path toward it. The lessons of the past weeks lingered, subtle but indelible. Attraction is not inherently destructive, but ignoring its implications can be. Emotional honesty requires courage, and the cost of avoidance is often far greater than the discomfort of truth. I realized that growth, trust, and love are not static, they demand attention, reflection, and deliberate action. Emily's absence left a quiet void, but not regret. The clarity she inadvertently brought into my life created space for intentionality, space to reconnect with Rachel, to reassess who I wanted to be, and to face the responsibilities I had long deferred. As I watched Rachel's silhouette against the porch light, I understood that the story was not about a single moment of temptation or misstep. It was about awareness, choice, and the courage to confront the truth before it eroded everything of value. And in that understanding, I found not only closure but perspective, that the most subtle signals, those quiet, unnoticed reflections of attention and recognition, can illuminate truths about ourselves, and about the lives we are entrusted to nurture. The chapter had ended, but the lesson remained. Life's quiet challenges demand acknowledgement, honesty, and the courage to act before indecision becomes regret.